Hi,
I'm Lauren.
and I'm Alex.
And we're two friends who moved out of the big city to see what the small town life was all about.
We're passionate about health, wellness, relationships, and entrepreneurial spirit.
Listen in weekly to hear all the wild details.
This is That's Wild.
Okay, well, hi guys. Welcome back to That's Wild, the podcast. We're super excited. Today we have a guest that we've wanted to get on the podcast for a while. He's actually both of our children's pediatricians right here in Brenham. But we are so excited to introduce you guys today to Dr. Derek Husmann. So Dr. Husmann, thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor. I really appreciate it. This, I'll admit, is my first podcast. But it's an exciting opportunity, so I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for coming on. I think first off, how long have you been practicing in pediatrics? What brought you to do pediatrics? All that good stuff. Let's go back in history.
Okay, well, I'll try to be brief. I first felt called to medicine during my second year of college, and I felt called to be a medical missionary. And I felt like the best field to do that in would be family practice, where you have the opportunity to take care of the whole age spectrum. So that's what I planned to do. And when I went into med school at Temple University in Philadelphia, that's what I planned on doing. And I got into my clinical rotations, and it wasn't until really my fourth year of med school that I did a few pediatric rotations, and I just realized, gosh, I really love pediatrics. I really love taking care of kids. But at that time, it was too late for me to kind of change my plan and program to match into family practice and switch to pediatrics. So I went ahead and I matched to family practice. I did a year of family practice training in Wilmington, Delaware. But during that year, I did another couple of rotations in pediatrics and just really felt the call to pediatrics. That was my passion. That's what I really loved. I loved taking care of kids. So I quit the residency to make the transition. I had to owe the Army 3 years of active duty. So I went in as a general medical officer and did that for 3 years. I was a general medical officer and a flight surgeon, and then went back and did my pediatric residency at University of Texas in San Antonio. And then I finished up at the University of Mississippi Medical Center in Jackson, Mississippi. So that's how I got to pediatrics. I finished my residency in 2005, so I've been working as an outpatient general pediatrician since then.
Awesome. Okay, so then have you been in Brenham ever since then, or how did you land in the Brenham area?
So I was born and raised in Houston, so my roots are not far from here. My first job out of residency was at a private practice in Tucson, Arizona, where my in-laws lived. And so we were there for 3 years, felt the need to change jobs or kind of move my career on, and really we were planning on staying in the Tucson area, and I almost bought a practice in Tucson. But at the same time, we were looking at opportunities in Texas. We wanted to be closer to my family if possible. And when all the dust settled, the job that really came through was in Brenham. So we've been here since 2009.
Okay. And tell everybody a little bit about your family, your kids, everything like that.
Oh, okay. I met my wife in Philadelphia. She was working as a nurse at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and even though I went into pediatrics, we never actually worked together, but we were part of, we went to the same church, and we were part of the same medical Christian student group called Medical Campus Outreach in CMDA, Christian Medical and Dental Society, in Philadelphia, and we met through that group. We didn't actually date when I lived in Philadelphia. We didn't start dating until I moved away with the Army. I was doing my first year of active duty in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt when we started dating. So we dated long distance and got engaged that year, but we knew each other very well. We had been friends for a very long time. And then I got transferred in the Army to Fort Carson as a flight surgeon, and we got married in Colorado Springs, had a honeymoon baby. Our oldest, Luke, was born 9 months after we were married. And so he is 21 now at UT Austin studying film. And then we have a 14-year-old son, Nathan, and an 8-year-old daughter, Kate. So
Awesome. So when you guys moved to Brenham, did you immediately start at Baylor Scott White or?
Well, I started the Brenham Clinic. So at the time that I came, the Brenham Clinic was still owned by the doctors of the practice, so a large multi-specialty group practice. But within a year, we were bought out by the College Station Medical Center. And then we had a very dramatic change in ownership back in 2018, where we were eventually bought by Baylor Scott and White. And so I worked at the Brenham Clinic until the end of 2021, worked for Baylor Scott and White those last 3 years or so. And then, left to start my own practice.
Okay. So walk us through that. So I know me personally, and we kind of walked back through this. We actually both had appointments with Dr. Husmann yesterday. So
without even knowing it.
Yeah.
I didn't plan that either.
I will say, I know. So we when we moved here, I have 3 young kids, you guys know, who are following along. And we moved here in the height of COVID. It was December 2020. And we went to the clinic because that's where everyone goes to get, to sign up to get a pediatrician. And really, my kids were never sick. I don't know if my kids ever had COVID or not. I did not test them, but they never got real sick during the COVID times. I think it was a blessing that we were able to see you just by chance, kind of, because I remember I was struggling with my daughter still, who would wake up every, at the beginning and in the middle of the night. And what really touched me and made me think, okay, we have a great doctor here, is of course we were going over everything medical, right? But we were talking about it, and you were telling me what was normal or not normal or whatever. And I said, she won't go to sleep. I think she's scared. She's this. And you said, you know what? It would be great if you could audibly pray about that. And I personally loved that. I was like, and as a Christian, I'm like, duh. I mean, maybe I should audibly pray for her to sleep through the night,
Yeah.
But I personally, our first couple interactions, I felt really good knowing that, it wasn't just going to be super clinical and super medical, but it was going to be like really trying to help us as a family with whatever we were going through. So I appreciated that so much. And I know I've heard that about you from a lot of other parents. So just want to say that.
Yes, thank you.
As we start.
Thank you for pointing that out. That those kind of things really warm my heart, especially when it comes to sleep issues and helping my patients get better sleep, which means parents get better sleep, which means parents are more rested, and they're happier parents, and they're better parents and healthier parents when everybody's getting more rest. And I think that story is a pretty good illustration of the way I like to practice medicine. And even though I would say I've tried to be holistic throughout my career, there's definitely different types of holistic care, and there's different ways to do that. And when I was in the system, so to speak, what I understood as holistic care is pretty different than what I'm discovering now that I'm more or less out of the system. Certainly not working for anybody but myself, and able to practice almost completely according to my conscience. So I'm we'll probably talk about this a little bit more later, but I've got a big learning curve. I'm learning a lot about truly holistic care. But thanks for bringing that up.
So I think that's what drew me to you, was after talking to Lauren and trying to get recommendations for a pediatrician once we moved here, was just hearing kind of your story and how you left the system to go do what you're doing now. So can you kind of tell us a little bit about that, about how you kind of have left the traditional medicine route behind and what you're doing now?
Yes, and I will. I'll try to keep it as upbeat as possible and positive. But I think most people, even before COVID, I think most people would say that at the very least, when it came to the healthcare system, there was so much about it that was broken and that made it either hard to get care or too complicated to get care or too complicated when you're receiving care. You didn't have the time that you needed with your doctor. The doctor didn't have the time that they wanted to have with their patients. And so many things about the system were broken. When I was working for Baylor Scott and White Health, and when you work for a large healthcare corporation, they really do their best to cross all their T's and dot all their I's when it comes to complying with the requirements of the government and health insurance companies, and they kind of cram you into a box. And the more that you work hard to comply and just do the right thing, the less you're able to actually feel like you're serving your patients well, which is so ironic. But that really was where medicine was prior to COVID. And then in many ways, COVID broke the system for lots of people. At least, people got so either frustrated or had such horrible experiences, sometimes life-threatening experiences, or sometimes actually dealing with, a family member passing away during COVID, in which the broken system not only destroyed their family member's health, but destroyed their ability to help their family member or be with their family member or show compassion and caring and love to their family member in their last days, in their greatest need. And it broke people, and it showed the broken system. And then for me, it really put me in a position where I decided I can't be a part of this for much longer. So I didn't know exactly how that was going to play itself out. And then, in 2021, when the COVID shot was rolled out, we kept hearing threats that it was going to be required for employment. And so I kind of knew that was going to come down the pike. I didn't know exactly how it would play out, but I kind of prepared myself for the possibility that might be the thing that pushed me out of my job, out of working in the system. And so I prepared myself for that. I didn't necessarily embrace it as something I really wanted to do, but kind of felt like it was something I needed to do. And so I could have, when we got the memo in July of 2021, I could have pivoted and requested an exemption, but I just decided, I shouldn't have to have an exemption for a shot that is being given under emergency use authorization. And so I told them I wasn't going to request an exemption. And then I was also advised to just let them fire me, because if there were ever any repercussions later, the best position to be in was if they actually fired me rather than me resigning. So they fired me. My last day was in October of 2021. And then, the story of how I decided to start my own practice goes back, to earlier years, but that's how it came about, just getting fired. Knowing that I could have stayed with the system if I really wanted to, but I knew that wasn't the place for me anymore. I just felt like I needed to move on. Somewhere, somehow, some way, I needed to move on to something where I could really truly practice according to my conscience.
Yeah. Well, and I think that wasn't something that was just affecting even just the medical community. It was everywhere. People were being forced to put something into their bodies because they wanted to keep their jobs. And it was kind of scary. I feel like everybody was kind of talking about it, or people were, worried about losing their jobs here and there and everywhere. But I'm curious if you had other doctors in your practice that you had discussed this with that felt the same as you and what they kind of did.
Yeah, I was thinking about that already. So at the end, the ironic thing in how that played itself out is that the physicians, so in our large multi-specialty group practice, we have all sorts, but the physicians in the practice that were most against the COVID shot were the pediatricians. So we're the same physicians that give the most shots to our patients, certainly in the first few years of life, and yet 3 out of the 4 of us didn't get the shot or didn't want to get the shot. And we also knew that our patients, thankfully, didn't really need the shot themselves. And so we had that perspective. We also had the blessing of not having to deal with our patients getting seriously ill or dying from COVID. I don't know of any pediatric patients in our practice that passed away from COVID or even suffered, overwhelming illness from COVID. And I'm very thankful for that. But 3 of us decided we didn't want to get it. 1 of us got an exemption. Another finally ended up getting the shot. And they have both stayed with the practice. There was also a family practice PA who didn't want to get the shot. And I think that she ended up getting an exemption. And then I was the only one in Washington County that got fired. And there was another doctor, a family practice doctor up in Bryant College Station who also got fired from Baylor Scott and White. But there weren't that many. In the end, there weren't that many that were willing to sacrifice, their livelihood on that hill in that battle, which which really saddens me.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you said that they were able to get an exemption, because I just assumed anybody who stayed on there got the shot. That's interesting, because I think, like you're saying, to have the ability to get the exemption also kind of puts a mirror up to you that it's like, well, I could get an exemption here and stay on, but is this really how I want to practice? Is this really what I want to stand up for? So I think that speaks to your integrity for saying, no, I'll just get fired and I'll find a way to kind of do this on my own, based on your beliefs. So I guess, what was that like? I mean, I would guess that even though you were fired, there were some things that you could and could not do. And how did you end up being able to kind of break away and start this, direct primary care?
Well, leaving Baylor Scott and White, thankfully, was pretty uneventful. And I kind of made a commitment not to make waves on my way out. I do remember, one really significant meeting we had with the office administrator and our kind of chief medical officer for our practice, and the pediatricians. 3 of the 4 of us didn't want to get the shot, and we were talking about it. And, we were able to have a pretty open, frank discussion. But at one point, I said, look, not everybody here supports this decision that we've made not to get this shot. But if you are willing to go along with us getting, forced to get a shot that we don't want, or marginalized or fired for not getting the shot, if you don't support us in our freedom to choose, then you're complicit in what happens to people who get the shot, whether it's, horrible adverse effects or even death, or people that get fired and get marginalized in society. The people that may support the shot, but they don't stand up for other people's freedom, they're also, complicit in what, the negative things that happen to people who do stand up. And it, unfortunately, it was crickets. It was honestly, nobody, they may have said something they may have said something personally, but they didn't take a stand. They didn't support in a way that made a difference. They didn't say at the end of the day, you know what, it's more important to keep Dr. Husmann at this practice where he can continue taking care of his patients the way he has for 13 years or plus than it is for him to get this shot. They didn't do that. And so, quietly, I just left when it was time for me to go, and moved on. But that was disheartening. It really was disheartening. And from what I've heard, that's basically the same thing that happened to lots and lots of other people. Now, a lot of other people on their way out got targeted, unfortunately. Thankfully, I didn't. I guess, I could have if I'd have tried. But I kind of made it a point not to try to get targeted or to make waves, because I kind of felt like it was an inevitability, and I needed to leave that system anyway. Does that answer your question well enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as far, and I think what kind of strikes me as you're talking about this is that like you said, pediatricians are giving the most shots to patients, to children on this vaccination schedule. And it's interesting that you thought, okay, this is an emergency use thing. It hasn't really been tested or anything like that, so I'm not going to do it. But it seems to me that in your kind of exit out of there, research became really important to you about what is these things, what are we giving to these kids. So Can you kind of describe to us what that's looked like, going from just practicing to really looking in to the emergency use, the COVID vaccination, among other things?
Yes. I will tell you that I've never been a particularly nerdy type doctor. I've never been a research oriented doctor, and I don't keep voluminous amounts of medical data in my head, but as soon as I heard about the mechanism by which the COVID shot was supposedly giving us immunity, I knew that there were just myriad problems with injecting into our bodies a piece of RNA that would go to whatever cell in our body it could go to and tell that cell to produce a protein, the spike protein, which was the most pathological feature of SARS-CoV-2, of the COVID-19 virus. It opened up a Pandora's box of negative possibilities, of ways that it could destroy our health, and a whole host of questions that weren't answered by those that told us that it was safe and effective. So, for instance, a very basic question is, well, when this piece of mRNA goes into your cell and your cell produces a protein from it, the RNA should be immediately degraded or destroyed by the parts of your cell that break that down, and it should recycle the usable material, the amino acids, and use them if necessary, or eliminate them from your body if they're not necessary or if they're harmful. And how long is that mRNA strand going to stay in that cell, and what is it going to do if it's not immediately broken down? And then you've got your cells producing a spike protein, which is supposed to create antibodies that confer this lasting immunity or some form of lasting immunity to coronavirus. And what happens to that spike protein? What happens if your body's immune system sees that a significant percentage of its own cells are creating this spike protein, which is a foreign invader, and then your body's immune system says, hey, what we need to do to foreign invaders is we need to destroy them. So not only does it destroy the foreign invaders, the spike protein, but it destroys the cells that they're coming out of, which is, another way of describing autoimmune disease. And that's exactly what happened. And then this spike protein, which we already knew was causing a whole host of health problems beyond just having a cold virus, such as myocarditis, or blood clots, strokes, heart attacks, and otherwise. Where's that spike protein going? How long is it going to stay in the body? When is it going to be broken down? How is it going to be broken down? Is it going to be completely eliminated? And on and on and on it goes. And so early on, I had an extreme bias against that kind of shot because it's a completely new so-called means of immunization. And I would argue that even though they're developing other mRNA shots, and if I really knew what the powers that be wanted to do, I would say that most likely they want all future immunizations to be genetic modification immunizations, so-called immunizations. That's what they want. Whereas previously, we would take usually portions of a bacteria or a virus or crippled live viruses, and we would inject those into children. Our bodies would identify them, our immune system would identify them, create antibodies, create lasting immunity almost always, and protect us from those infections. This new mRNA technology is a completely different way of doing it and a much more dangerous way, fraught with many more possible side effects. One of the fascinating things that I came across in my research on the COVID-19 shot was the fact that Moderna, as a corporation, a healthcare corporation creating this kind of technology, was started in the late 2000s. And in over 10 years, it had never had one single mRNA technology health product approved by the FDA. Not a single product, but they were still viable somehow. Somebody was funding them, but they never had anything approved by the FDA. And of course, now they've made billions and billions of dollars, and they still have nothing approved by the FDA. It's not safe enough to be approved according to the usual channels. So that's how I basically had an implicit mistrust of the COVID-19 shot. And then when I left the system, I just felt like I needed to do a deeper dive into all the other immunizations. And in doing so, as I think I've mentioned to both of you privately, the more that I find out about the immunizations that we've been giving since the 1950s, starting with polio basically, the more I don't like what I'm finding. And you know, we could talk about that for hours, but the more I don't like what we're finding, and I think that we're replacing infectious diseases in children with chronic disease by giving them all these immunizations.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of That's Wild, the podcast with Lauren and Alex. I am so excited to keep on going with this podcast because it's like our weekly girls' night in, and you're invited to the most fun-filled chat about the wildest stuff happening out there. Think of us as your BFFs who spill the tea on all the crazy things you didn't even know you needed to know. And just like the awesome friend you just heard from, we've got a lineup of fabulous guests waiting to dish out the juiciest stories and the coolest, inspiring information. We just want to leave you inspired, motivated, or simply mind blown by something that'll have you texting your friends like, "Did you know this?" Now, here's the deal, lovely listeners. We want to hear from you too. So grab your phones, slide into our voicemail with your thoughts, questions, or even your own wild stories. And if you've been having as much fun as we are, why not share the love? A 5-star review is like the best virtual high five we could ask for. Don't forget to hit that follow button so you never miss out on our weekly girls' night. You know, you don't want to miss it. Thanks for joining us today, friends. Until next time, keep it fun, keep it fabulous, and keep the good vibes flowing with That's Wild, the podcast.